The storm came without warning, an Uttarakhand cloudburst so brutal it felt as if the sky had split open and emptied its fury all at once. First, a sharp wind swept through Devpur, bending the deodar trees like they were bowing to something unseen. Then, without a gradual build, sheets of rain slammed into the valley, loud enough to drown out every human voice. And as the water kept falling, the river below began to change. Quiet currents thickened into a violent surge, as if a sleeping beast had been shaken awake. Within minutes, the river swelled past its usual banks, expanding with an old, dangerous confidence. It clawed at stones, uprooted saplings, and dragged broken branches along like weapons. Worse still, it carried something heavier than debris, the haunting memory of past floods, the kind elders spoke about in low voices. Even in the dark, the water looked angry, muddy, twisting, and determined. And because Devpur had built its life close to the river, the first thing to suffer was the village's lifeline. The wooden bridge, old but trusted, began to shudder under the pressure of the rising current. At first, it was only a tremble, then a groan, and finally a deep crack that echoed against the mountains. For a breathless moment, it held, yet the river did not negotiate. With a thunderous snap, the bridge split in two and dropped into the flood like a fallen rib, vanishing beneath the foam. It wasn't just timber breaking, it was certainty breaking, trust breaking between people and the land they thought they understood. Almost immediately afterward, the mountains joined the chaos. Saturated slopes let go of their grip, and landslides thundered down in roaring waves of rock and soil. Homes shook, roofs leaked, footpaths disappeared under moving earth. Villagers poured into the rain, slipping in mud, calling names into darkness that swallowed every sound. Lakshmi ran through it all with her teenage son, Arun, clutched close. She was a widow, and grief had already carved endurance into her face, but even her strength shook. Still, she did what mothers do when the world collapses. She moved forward anyway. "Stay with me," she yelled, pulling Arun away from the river's roar. Arun's eyes were wide, reflecting lightning and fear. "Where do we go?" Lakshmi didn't answer immediately, because the truth was cruel. In a disaster like this, you don't go to safety, you search for it. So she dragged him uphill through the darkness, past neighbors who stumbled and cried out, past walls that cracked, and fields that dissolved into streams. Eventually, after what felt like hours but could have been minutes, the rain eased enough for dawn to arrive. Morning didn't bring comfort, instead it revealed the damage in brutal detail. Devpur lay scarred and quiet, as if the valley itself was in shock. The bridge was gone, several homes had been crushed by slides, fields near the riverbank were erased, and where laughter used to rise from courtyards, there was only the hush of survival. Yet even in that silence, people gathered, because humans do that after catastrophe. They count who is missing, they share what is left, and they decide what must happen next. Consequently, the survivors began moving uphill, away from the river that had fed their crops and watered their animals, but had also taken their safety without apology. At the center of this slow, painful migration was Lakshmi, steadying others even as she carried her own fear. Beside her walked Arun, still shaken yet burning with an unfamiliar determination to be useful. Their new settlement began as a cluster of temporary shelters on higher ground. It wasn't fertile like the river plain, and it wasn't familiar like the old lanes of Devpur. However, it was safer. And for people who had just watched the land betray them, safer mattered more than comfortable. So the village worked. Men and women raised wooden frames for homes with hands still bruised from digging survivors out of mud. Meanwhile, youths cleared terraces for crops where the soil was thinner but stable. Children, too young to carry beams, planted saplings in neat rows along the slope because someone had told them roots could hold earth the way fingers hold a ledge. And while the rebuilding looked ordinary from a distance, it was guided by lessons written in floodwater. Food stores were raised on platforms. Emergency bags were packed in every home with essentials: torch, dry food, copies of IDs, and basic medicines. Evacuation paths were marked with painted stones so that even at night, even in panic, people could find a way upward. Most importantly, families made a pact. When heavy rain comes, no one waits for one more hour. They move early, together. In other words, they rebuilt not just houses, but habits. We did not move to escape the river. We moved to give it room to breathe. And for the first time since the cloudburst, hope felt like something Devpur could hold again. However, hope has a way of attracting the attention of people who see opportunity. A few weeks later, a convoy of officials and engineers climbed the narrow mountain road to the new settlement. Their vehicles looked out of place on the muddy track, shiny, loud, confident. They stepped out wearing crisp uniforms and carrying rolled-up maps. Their smiles were professional, yet their eyes skimmed the hillside with calculation, not compassion. The villagers gathered, wary but polite, because authority arrives like weather. You cannot stop it, only prepare for it. At the community meeting, the lead engineer unfurled a large blueprint across a table. He announced, "We intend to rebuild the old village site. It will bring economic revival, better roads, better markets, better access to services." For a moment, nobody spoke. Down below, the river flowed calmer now, almost innocent, but it wasn't peaceful. It was watchful, heavy, as if holding its breath. Lakshmi's jaw tightened. Arun, surprisingly, stepped forward first. His voice didn't shake, even if his hands did. "But that land belongs to the river now." A few engineers exchanged amused glances. One scoffed under his breath. "Superstition," he muttered, louder than he meant. Then, trying to sound reassuring, the lead engineer added, "We've run the numbers, the risk is minimal." Yet the villagers didn't relax. They had lived the minimal risk. They had heard wood crack, felt ground move, and watched water rewrite maps in one night. So the imbalance became clear: numbers versus lived experience, confidence versus trauma. And just like that, the conflict began, not loud at first, but sharp enough to cut. In the days that followed, tensions settled into Devpur like lingering damp. Community halls lit with lanterns filled with arguments and uneasy silences. Elders spoke first, because elders always carry the long memory. They described floods from decades earlier, the ones that stole cattle, swallowed farmland, and left families searching the riverbanks for names that would never answer. Then the youth responded with their own proof: shaky phone videos from the recent cloudburst, the roar of the river captured in sound that made even strong men flinch. Ravine replayed clips frame by frame, pointing out how fast the water rose, how the soil liquefied, how the bridge surrendered. Still, the engineers remained unmoved. One insisted, "Our updated hydrological models show minimal probability of another major event. Development must continue." So, two worlds began to collide. On one side, engineers projected clean digital simulations, geometric river lines, tidy probabilities, controlled outcomes. On the other side, villagers knelt outside in the dirt, drawing the river's ancient paths with their fingers, tracing where water once ran before concrete walls and narrow embankments forced it into a tighter throat. The contrast was almost painful: technology that looked certain and memory that felt certain. Finally, Lakshmi stepped between them, her voice slicing through the growing heat. Models predict possibility, memories describe reality. Nevertheless, the next morning, survey poles appeared in the floodplain. Measuring instruments stood like tiny flags of arrogance in soil still bruised by landslides. Engineers hammered stakes into ground that had not finished grieving, and from the hillside, villagers watched in silence, because sometimes anger doesn't shout, it waits. At that point, the fight stopped being only about land. It became about whose knowledge mattered and whose warning would be ignored until it was too late. Soon, the mountain began to answer. Small signs appeared first, subtle but unnerving.
Near the proposed reconstruction zone, thin cracks spread across the soil like spiderwebs drawn overnight. The engineers dismissed them as natural settling because that explanation fit neatly into their paperwork. Yet the villagers exchanged looks that said, "We have seen this language before." Then, one morning, a minor landslide slumped across the mountain road. No one was hurt, and the damage was small enough to clear by hand. However, the timing felt deliberate, like a gentle shove from the land, "Not here." Even the animals reacted. Goats that usually rushed downhill for grass paused at the path, snorted, and refused to descend. A few dogs howled at the river at odd hours, as if sensing pressure in the air that humans had not named yet. Arun began documenting everything: cracks, shifting soil, hesitant animals, new seepage lines after rain. He filmed with quiet intensity, murmuring to himself, "Proof, we need proof." Meanwhile, the engineers kept moving forward, because plans have momentum and pride has weight. Their equipment multiplied, their markers spread, and every new stake felt to the villagers like another step toward repeating disaster. But nature, once it starts speaking, rarely whispers for long. So, as tension climbed, Devpur decided it would no longer rely on quiet objections. One afternoon, the entire community gathered, elders, mothers, youths, and children, and marched down the slope to the construction site. They didn't come with weapons, they came with bodies, banners, and oil lamps. They formed a peaceful sit-in around the survey stakes, linking arms and sitting shoulder to shoulder. Engineers protested, officials argued, yet the villagers did not move. By sunset, each family placed a candle along the riverbank, not randomly, but carefully, following the remembered line of the river's historical flood path. One flame became 10 became 50, and soon a glowing ribbon traced the boundary the river had always claimed. It was remembrance made visible, grief turned into geometry. Lakshmi stepped forward with the final candle trembling in her hand. Her voice carried across the floodplain, firm enough to steady others. "We do not fight growth, we fight forgetfulness. The river remembers every path it has taken, and every path we tried to block." The engineers exchanged tense whispers. They couldn't bulldoze through people sitting arm in arm, and they couldn't extinguish a memorial that lit up the floodplain like a quiet prophecy. Their frustration simmered, but the villagers' unity held, forming a human shield made of memory, love, and survival. Therefore, the stage was set for a confrontation that no meeting room could settle. Then the monsoon arrived early. At first, it was only a drizzle, soft enough to feel harmless. But by afternoon, steady rain settled over the valley like an uninvited guest who refused to leave. Villagers watched from the hillside as the river below began to stir, rising inch by inch, darkening as it swallowed runoff from the slopes. It wasn't violent, not like the night Devpur was destroyed, yet it was enough to reveal the truth everyone had been arguing about. The muddy water stretched outward and swallowed the survey poles first, as if erasing human insistence. Half the construction markers disappeared next. Bright flags, symbols of the engineers' certainty, dipped beneath the surface one by one. And then, as if the mountain wanted to underline the lesson, a small but sudden landslide tumbled down near the engineers' equipment. Tripods skidded, measuring tools toppled and vanished into slush. No one was hurt, but denial took a hit it couldn't recover from. This time, the engineers couldn't look away. Arun, already filming, switched to live stream. Rain hammered his phone screen, but his voice cut through the noise. "This is why we said no," he shouted. Within hours, the video spread across social media, shared by journalists, disaster researchers, and citizens furious at preventable risk. Consequently, district officials took notice, not because they suddenly became wise, but because public pressure is louder than policy. By nightfall, emergency vehicles arrived, sirens echoing against the mountains. The engineers stood drenched and silent, watching their models get corrected by water and gravity in real time. Their confidence didn't break like a crack in the bridge, It dissolved slowly, like chalk in rain. Nature had spoken again, and this time, everyone heard. In the weeks that followed, the government launched a full inquiry. Experts reviewed Arun's footage alongside geological surveys and rainfall records. They interviewed elders, listened to Lakshmi, and walked the floodplain themselves. And when the conclusion came, it was not delivered as a suggestion. Traditional ecological knowledge must guide development in hazard-prone zones. When the engineers returned, they did not bring blueprints. Instead, they brought apologies. Awkward, imperfect, but real enough to matter. The villagers accepted them, not with triumph, but with restrained quiet, because wisdom is not meant to shame, it is meant to prevent suffering. Afterward, planning began again, this time properly. Officials worked with villagers to mark no-build zones. Drainage routes were cleared, slope stabilization and afforestation were funded. A community early warning system was discussed, including rain gauges, WhatsApp alert chains, and designated safe shelters on high ground. And because Devpur had learned the hard way, every new step was measured not only by cost, but by consequence. One evening, as the river flowed calmly under fading light, Lakshmi and Arun walked along its edge. The air smelled clean, washed by rain. The water looked almost gentle, almost like the river from their childhood, yet neither of them forgot what it could become. They placed a single candle on a stone near the bank. The flame flickered once, threatened by wind, and then steadied, small, persistent, alive. Lakshmi watched the light for a long moment before speaking. "We can't control the river," she said softly, "but we can choose whether we respect it." Arun nodded, his phone finally lowered, his eyes on the water instead of a screen. Devpur had not only survived, it had remembered, and in remembering, through caution, unity, and hard-won humility, it had begun to heal.